gratitude to the organizers of the conference for inviting me to give or deliver the keynote address. The invitation to deliver this keynote address could not have come at a better time than this critical sandwich moment for Africa. And I call it sandwich moment for Africa because we have mixed perceptions in terms of what is going on in Africa. On one side, we have hope and belief that the future is quite promising. But on the other side of the coin, we see also ongoing political tensions, crisis in some parts of Africa. You go to eastern side, western side, Central Africa, southern side. They all offer us a timely reminder that as we dream for a single market, barrier-free market for Africa within the framework of CFTA, African CFTA, there's still a lot of groundwork to do in order to smoothen the implementation of the CFTA in line with the trajectory of the AU Agenda 2063. I took time to scan the program and check on the presentation and the topics. All that I can say, I've been appetized and convinced that the critical thoughts, engaging discussions which are ahead of us presents quite a good promise in terms of stimulating, enriching, and be able to traverse through various diverse angles within the broad spectrum of CFTA. In this regard, the leadership of the African International Economic Law Network deserves our special praise and commendation for drawing up and pulling together such a good mixture of the audience and participants, ranging from new research comers, emerging ones, experienced researchers, experienced experts, the high quality works and good track records in their works in relation to regional trade arrangements. So we are assured that the 3 days which we are going to spend here are going to be constructive by having the opportunity to digest, critique, and also constructively debate the trajectory of African Continental Free Trade Area implementation from the lens of the international economic law. On a side note, the choice of Tanzania as the venue for this conference ought to be appreciated in its proper context. Tanzania has had a very instrumental role in what we call Africa emancipation, the liberation of Africa. Just in 1960s throughout 1980s, Tanzania played a very instrumental role in helping other African countries to liberate or emancipate from the clutches of colonial powers under the stewardship of our beloved late first president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere. Nyerere, of interest, together with other African leaders, prominent African leaders, to mention few, such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, and also the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, they all had a dream for Africa and a dream for having a united continent, a united Africa. So beyond the academic discussion, it's also important, the way I've structured my keynote address, to revisit history of Africa Union, so that we can appreciate why today we have the CFTA as one of the milestone achievements under the African Union. So I encourage you, as the opening address mentioned, for you also to explore the city of Dar Es Salaam, because beyond the conference and academic discourse which you're going to have, Dar es Salaam offers quite a diverse cultural ambience for you to explore. You can appreciate the mix of Swahili culture, which is also mixed with the Asian and Western culture. So you'll not be disappointed at the end of the day. I hope you'll have time to go around and explore the city of Dar Es Salaam, in particular enjoying a wide array of refreshing places, delicious cuisine as we've enjoyed the lunch. I hope everyone has enjoyed the Tanzanian and the Swahili touch from the banquet that we've enjoyed, and also diverse culture which are available here in Tanzania. And some of you have noted will go to Zanzibar to see the other part of United Republic of Tanzania. So colleagues, delivering a keynote address to researchers and distinguished academic audience like the one which is before me is never an easy task. And in some cases, it can also be intimidating. So the expectation may be high, and I'll try to live up to the expectation. But the good thing which makes me more comfortable is that we are living in the world of academic freedom. So I've got a latitude of freedom to decide in terms of the issues, and we've been assured by Professor Gathi that we can critique. We do not have to agree on each and everything, and this is the beauty of academic freedom. So I'll crave for your indulgence as I invoke the spirit of academic freedom in this keynote address, and allow me to focus not necessarily on the text of the agreement establishing CFTA, but I can also navigate through other areas which are quite informing also in the context of CFTA. Thus, I've organized my address into three important angles or context. First, I'll try to capture the historical origin of continental free trade area for Africa within the context of African Renaissance. And I'll try to argue that a proper and correct model of assessment in terms of the implementation of CFTA ought or must inevitably navigate through and revisit the fundamental ideals of the African Union as traceable from not only its constitutive act, but also revisiting the objective of the predecessor to African Union, and here I'm referring to the Organization of African Union. Secondly, my address will also focus on questioning whether in Africa we have in place the prerequisite foundations for effective participation of Africans in the continental free trade area to avoid a plight of Africans being peripheral participants or otherwise spectators of the free trade in Africa. So that will answer the question, free trade for African continent for who? Are we prepared? Are we there yet to be able to tap all the opportunities which comes with the African continental free trade area? And what laws and economics ought to do in that respect? Third, dealing with the regulatory intricacies and impediments arising from the current setup of laws, particularly the focus on intellectual property laws and investment laws as exemplified in existing regional blocks. And my focus will be on EAC, East Africa Community. We have some interesting cases which have been ruled in courts of law, which could provide an important insight in the context of the African continental free trade area on what should be done in the context of intellectual property law and investment law. And finally, I'll highlight some of the pertinent questions and issues for future research and regulatory calibration. So let me start with a bit of history about the CFTA. And I'll be very brief in this regard. But my point, the purpose for this is at least for us to appreciate what are the fundamental objectives and ideas which are contemplated by the founders of AU and its predecessor, the Organization of African Unity. So what I would like to start with regard to tracing the roots of why CFTA is relevant, the history of CFTA is relevant for research, it's important that we appreciate the origin or the initiative that led to the formation of CFTA cannot be separated from the African post-independence initiatives aimed at uniting and fortifying the intra-continental political and economic ties and cooperation in Africa. One should be able to appreciate that from the very outset, the founders, or rather the architects of the current continental institutions in Africa, had in mind a vision for Africa, which was centered on, among others, economic cooperation and integration. As early as 1960s, we understand most of the African countries obtained their independence late 1950s and early 1960s. Diplomatic consultations started for formulating an organization with African identity that appreciate the context in which political and economic institutions and balance of power in Africa ought to be shaped and evolve within the continent. One of the notable events was in 1963. 25th May 1963, the Organization of African Unity, or AU, was formed as an intra-governmental organization. Now, of interest for us in the context of CFTA is to appreciate the key aims of OAU. Now, there are several, but I focus on the aim to encourage political and economic integration. So it was thought by the founder that economic integration, trade integration in itself may not achieve the intended purpose unless we also merge it, connect it with political integration among member states of African Organization of African Unity, and to eradicate colonialism and neocolonialism from African continent. So the basis or the objective, the fundamental target was to encourage political and economic integration. Now, if you read the OAU Charter, it outlines several objectives, and I'll highlight some of these objectives as have been listed in the OAU Charter. One included promote unity and solidarity of the African states. In order to achieve trade objectives within the continent, political will is a critical component. And you cannot afford to envision an integrated market for Africa without having a political will, where we all share the same dream. Two, OAU also, based on its charter, one of the objectives was to coordinate and intensify their cooperation and efforts to achieve better life for the peoples of Africa. And from the morning, you could hear the theme repeatedly being mentioned: inclusiveness. To what extent all Africans are taken on board. So the point which we are driving here is, from the very outset, the OAU had this in mind, that whatever we do in terms of cooperation, the ultimate beneficiaries should be the people of Africa. And I'm trying to make a case in my opening speech, my keynote address, that we need to revisit this in the context of CFTA. To what extent the initiatives which are ongoing are also inclusive, or takes into account the benefit, the ultimate beneficiary, who should be the peoples of Africa. The other objective under the OAU Charter was to eradicate all forms of colonialism. All forms of colonialism. Colonialism has been manifested in various forms. And we have heard about this terminology, neo-colonialism, where you are politically told you are free, but intellectually you're not free. Economically, you are dependent. So the framers of the OAU Charter had this in all forms of colonialism. So we need to interrogate, what are these forms of colonialism, and to what extent within the context of African continental free trade area, all those forms of colonialism are being addressed such that the people of Africa will benefit from the CFTA. and also to promote international cooperation in the process. So that was the dream, that was the vision under OAU, which unfortunately is no longer in place and was disbanded in 2002, and it was replaced by African Union. Now, there are interesting debates and also research along the line why it was necessary to change from OAU to AU. Was it just a matter of dropping O to remain with AU? It was more than that. One of the setbacks under OAU was said to be it was more of a political cover for African leaders. So the change was necessitated in order to shift from what was referred to as dictators' club to a people-based grouping. People-based grouping. Again, we go back to the inclusive component, which should be high on the agenda under AfCFTA. Also, AU had one of its core aims centered on promoting democratic principles and institutions, popular participation, and good governance. And these are crucial fundamentals or ideals for trade and investment to thrive. Trade and investment cannot thrive, cannot be achieved, the objective cannot be achieved without popular participation and good governance. We've mentioned about examples, experience which has happened in some countries, including the recent example in Kenya, where Gen Z coming out, which they feel they are not part of the process, they are not heard, they are not considered in policy formulation. So this should serve as a warning sign in terms of the future implementation of the continental free trade area in Africa, to appreciate the essence of having a participatory approach. To what extent the people not only are said to be engaged or participating, but they actually feel that they are participating in the process. So consequently, ever since the AU came into being in 2002, several continental initiatives were adopted in order to galvanize economic development of Africa. And these have included several initiatives, and I'll mention two. In 2008, we had this accelerated industrial development for Africa as a strategy, and the idea was to boost the Africa manufacturing capacity so that we can be players in the continental and the global market. And the AU agenda is another milestone which was adopted in 2023. The AU Agenda 2026, the Africa we want, which resulted or led to the formation or adoption of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, the Agenda 2063 merit a special consideration as we envisage the status of implementation of the CFTA in the context of Africa. The Agenda 2026, AU Agenda 2026 is Africa Blueprint and Master Plan for transforming Africa into a global powerhouse of the future. Now, if you take time to look at its strategic framework, you'll come to realize that it aims broadly so to achieve what we call inclusive and sustainable development, and its concrete manifestation of the Pan-African drive for unity, self-determination, freedom, progress, and what is termed as collective prosperity pursued under Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance. So this is part and parcel to what is considered to be a revolutionary idea in terms of transforming Africa, not only to be importers and also spectators in international trade and international economy, rather taking key role in participation of international trade and the production in the value chain process. The genesis of AU Agenda 2063 was the realization of the African leader that there was a need to refocus and reprioritize African agenda for inclusive social and economic development, continental and regional integration for repositioning Africa in the global balance of trade. So there is a monumental objective ahead of the broader picture of having CFTA, because the AU Agenda 2063 does not look Africa inwardly, rather building capacity of Africa so that Africa can compete in the global trade landscape. So why are we bothering and interested in these continental past events and milestones? I think this is an important question. It's because African Continental Free Trade Area is a brainchild of the AU Agenda 2063, and by extension, this is my argument, it originated from the fundamental objectives of the dissolved OAU, the very first intra-governmental organization in Africa post-independence, which was dissolved in 2002. Thus, this is my argument, is a proper assessment, yardstick, of the ultimate implementation of African Continental Free Trade Area should, inevitably so, always be predicated on the underlying broad continental objectives as enshrined in the constitutive instrument of AU and her predecessor, OAU. It is pertinent that we undertake a thorough, deep diving research into the extent within which the current implementation measures under African Continental Free Trade Area are reflective of the underlying original continental objectives and parameters, focusing on, among others, number one, unity, solidarity of African states, intensified cooperation to achieve a better life for the peoples of Africa, eradication of all forms of colonialism, including neo-colonialism, promoting international cooperation and inclusive social and economic development, continental and regional integration. This should be, and I'm submitting, that there is a need to reorient the current research for African Continental Free Trade Area to include aspects of reviewing and developing a proper narrative on such pertinent issues, on how the implementation of CFTA should be anchored along such overriding continental dictates. And that leads us to a second point, that for who are we developing the free market for Africa? It's an important question, because if we attempt to hide from it, the consequences of hiding or trying to ignore it will be manifested in a crisis which are taking place in many countries. So it's very important to ask ourselves whether the market which we are developing for Africa, the free market, will really be free for Africans. How are they going to play an important role? Now, before I discuss this, I would like to point out, by way of anecdote, I had a client here in Tanzania who at some point got a very big deal or tender to supply onions to Seychelles. And the arrangement was every week, one container of onions. And the payments were guaranteed. One container of onions. I want to draw a point that whether we are ready for a free market where billion plus people will be there. Now, having got the contracts, we negotiated, we signed, and the supplier, my client, started to supply a container of onions to Seychelles. Every week, one container. The first week, good deal. Second week, there was a bit of delay. A third week, no sufficient onions. He couldn't fill a container. Then he came back to me and asked, what should we do in order to amend the contract, to cut down the supplies? Instead of a full container, we go to a quarter. I said, why? How did you project that you are able to supply a container every week with a specified prescription in terms of size and quality? He said, you know, as I was traveling around Tanzania, I could see a lot of people selling onions. So I thought the supply will be there. Only to realize it's a mammoth, a monumental task to collect a container of onions every week. So what is the point? We're talking about the capacity to meet the demands. We may be talking from the legal text in terms of we need free trade. This needs to be done. You remove tax, you remove these barriers. But to what extent are Africans and institutions, traders, in terms of their capacity, the financing models, have been prepared to meet the demands? So my argument here is to make a case that we may envision a free trade area for the continent. Do we have enough supplies? Do we have production capacities? Who will be able to meet consistently the needed supply? Now, enticingly, the text of the CFTA agreement and its implementing protocol, as would be expected, loudly claimed that they are all meant to spur socioeconomic progress of Africa and its people. That's the language which is used in the key instrument, the agreement and the protocol for implementation. However, beyond those good and attractive semantics, there is a need for a critical appraisal in terms of the production level, the industrial, the innovation capacity. We need to appraise, to engage in informed research such that those broad claims for spurring socioeconomic progress of Africa and its people, and assertions like that will be diligently assessed and also checked whether Africa as a continent is properly equipped and prepared to embrace the full spectrum of fundamental issues and ramifications of the free market in Africa as far as African participation in the expanded continental market is concerned. In this regard, perhaps the pertinent question should be on what it takes for inclusive participation of Africa in the continental trade. What it takes for Africans to take effective participation. Arguably, various analytical angles may be deployed to assess the level of preparedness of Africa and Africans. In my view, in interrogating this question, we need to look at the entire supply chain. We need to look at the entire supply chain management, mapping up the innovation level, mapping up the production capacity, mapping up the agricultural outputs that are coming. I was reading the economics at one point, and they are reporting about Bill Gates having a potato farm in the US so big that you can see it from outer space. So we're talking about levels of production, large-scale production. How many do we have in Africa? Do we have that capacity? We may have from foreign investment, foreign participation, but we need to interrogate and map up in terms of local capacity. Of course, capital is an issue in that respect. Technology is an issue in terms of engaging in large-scale production to meet the demands of the expanded market platform in Africa. But those are the questions which are crucial. And that's my argument, that we cannot isolate economic law as an independent discipline without engaging with the very economics. Economics should inform the laws of economic law in terms of what should be done in order to create a system that is appreciative of the context in which Africa has been growing, the context in which Africa is producing, so that we can come up with appropriate policies and laws that target the capacity building, progressive inclusion of African in the supply chain management. So we look at all stages: production stage, industrial capacity, business financing models for small and large businesses. What are the terms and accessibility to these? Infrastructural setbacks and other credentials for successful participation in the continental trade. If we hide from these from research point of view, we'll be doing injustice to our continent. Because at the end of the day, what will happen is the borders will be open, but who will be there to lead the show? Foreign investors. Will be the role of Africans, maybe doing these petty works, employees. We understand we cannot manage on our own, but there should be concrete measures and plans in terms of how these matters are addressed. So toward this end, it is pertinent to highlight that the current level of industrialization and technological development in Africa raises some legitimate concerns over the internal or domestic ability to produce, manufacture, and supply the needed quantities and quality of the product. One of the very simple questions to ask ourselves is, where does Africa fare in the Global Innovation Index? I took time to look at the 2023 Global Innovation Index, where it's mapped up in terms of the level of innovation across the globe. Who is leading? China. Now, if you look at that innovation index, it tells a lot of stories of the economic powerhouse across the globe. Now, in 2023 Global Innovation Index, China, regarding patents only, we're talking about innovation. In 2023, they had 1.5 million patents filed in China. 1.5 million patents filed in China. We may question in terms of the quality of those patents, in terms of the level of innovation and in terms of inventive step. But the bottom line is there was 1.5 million inventions filed in China. Who is second from China? USA. How many patents? 0.5 million. 0.5 million. So what's the point? The point here is, if you control intellectual property, you control the market. As I'm going to discuss in two cases which have been ruled in East Africa. We have an interesting publication which is titled Patent Wars. Patent Wars. How patents affect your daily lives. If we are trying to or attempt to ignore that these are peripheral matters in trade, we are making a very big mistake. So it's crucial to assess, critically assess, in terms of ability, of domestic ability to produce, manufacture, and also supply needed quantities and quality of the products. The preamble of interest, the preamble of CFTA Protocol on Investment recognizes the increasing importance of trade and investment for the inclusive growth and industrial development of Africa, and the role played by the private sector in expanding productive capacity, creating jobs, facilitating transfer of technology, as well as building regional, continental, and the global value chains. Now, if you take time to read the objectives of the Protocol on Investment, it says several eye-striking points. It says, number one, encouraging intra-Africa investment flow. Intra-Africa investment flow. Number two, establishing a balanced, predictable, and transparent continental legal and institutional framework for investment. Number 3, to provide a sound legal framework for the prevention, management, and settlement of investment disputes, encouraging the acquisition and transfer of appropriate and relevant technology for Africa, without detailing the exact contribution of local Africans in the process. Now, you look at the bilateral investment agreements across. The sample and templates are the UNCTAD websites where you can check on the BITs. Interestingly and consistently now, intellectual property is being included as one of the investment aspects. So what are we talking about? In the current trade and investment regime, the know-how, technology is now considered as an investment on its own. It's not necessarily a cash-based deposits in a particular jurisdiction or economy that will be considered to be an investment. Even the know-how, we see now in Tanzania we have KFC, but KFC is a Kentucky thing. And how do they get money out of it? It's franchise. We're talking about the power of brand to sell. And these people are making lots of money, sitting in Kentucky, enjoying the royalty being paid on a monthly basis. How can Africa move all along to get to that point? And here we're talking about Forex being transferred to other countries. So these are issues which we need to engage within the framework of CFTA in order to appreciate not only intellectual property, but also our participation in the investment process. As one of the intervention, as I've mentioned already, AU adopted a strategy known as Accelerated Industrial Development for Africa, which of interest restate the commitment to the industrialization of the continent. This was done in 2008, and AU further endorsed and adopted the plan of action for that strategy for the accelerated industrial development for Africa and directed the Commission for the African Union to speedily operationalize its collaboration with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, and United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, and other development partners to accelerate implementation of the accelerated industrial development for Africa. But where are we since 2008? It's now about 16 years ever since. Where do we stand? What the statistics tell us in terms of participation of Africans in the production process, investment ventures, and also industrialization? Is still a $1 million question, $1 million question, which is yet to be answered. But what we see is the growing dominance of foreign investors, foreign establishment in African market. We need to question our ambitions in terms of where are we heading in the short term, medium term, and long term. And it is us who are in the academic circles who have got a platform to question these issues, to raise the fundamental questions which will be of assistance to policymakers and lawmakers, and perhaps leaders will understand and hear us at some point. Now, there are 7 pillars which have been developed as part of the plan of action, and these reads the 7 clusters in terms of implementation of speedy or accelerated industrial development. Number 1, industrial policy and institutional direction. At national level, regional level, and continental level, do we have a same saying, same position, same direction? Are we sailing to the same direction with regard to industrial policy and institutional direction? Upgrading production and trade capacity, that's number 2. Number 3, promoting infrastructure and energy for industrial development. This has been a big issue within the continent. In the, I think, welcomingly, Mark, it was pointed out that somewhere to travel to Tanzania from South Africa, they have to go to Addis Ababa, come back to Dar es Salaam. The continent is fragmented in terms of the infrastructural connectivity. So how are we talking about trade, movement of goods within the continent? if the infrastructure is not yet fully developed, such that we have a single unit in terms of transportation infrastructure, but also human resource development for industrial development. Do you have the people to take key positions? I know in South Africa they had this black empowerment program where in every key managerial position you have to have a black person. That was, in a way, arbitrary measure to bring blacks within the decision-making process, which is a commendable initiative. But we want to be there on merit, and we need to prepare the population to take these key positions in terms of decision-making, projections in terms of the future of Africa industrialization. So human resource development for industry, and we're talking about the modern industry where now we see the artificial intelligence coming in, blockchain technologies, all these dimensions have impact in terms of ability to produce and ability to supply. Number 5 within the pillars is industrial innovation systems, research and development and technology development. What is the funding of, level of funding in research and development in your respective countries? How many percentage of your budget goes to R&D? We need, we know the AU had this, our AU had this mission that we need to have at least 1% of the budget allocated to research and development. There's no way we can move and be competitive without funding and be serious when it comes to research and development, and particularly technology development. Financing and resource mobilization is a pillar number 6, and number 7, sustainable development. So these 7 clusters or pillars for accelerated implementation of industrialization in Africa, in my view, should be at the center of the agenda for the implementation of the CFTA. They constitute an important baseline for building proper and sustainable local production setup and capacity. Accordingly, the current legal discourse, research, and narrative should be directed at critically assessing on how the laws and the legal framework should be structured to appreciate not only the local content, rather the local context. Not only the local content, but also the local context. In May 2024, WIPO adopted a very interesting treaty on genetic resources. And I was checking around in terms of what does this mean to Africa. Protection of GR, genetic resources. One of our richest resources are in genetic resources. Do we consider this as part and parcel of the CFTA, that this is now crucial? We have the international consensus on how to protect GR and acknowledge the source. For decades, or centuries we may say, genetic resources have been taken from Africa and other least developed countries, then underwent production and amplification, then they're being sold to us as medicine, pharmaceutical products. And we pay more. And when we talk about pharmaceutical products, this is a multi-billion-dollar monster across the global and international economy. So these are the questions which we need to interrogate. To what extent the intellectual property protocol under CFTA is cognizant to these global developments, which are now changing the landscape in which patents will be protected across the globe. That discussion for adoption of this treaty on GLR, the WIPO Treaty on Genetic Resources and Traditional Knowledge, has been on table for over 20 years, 30 years, debating. And the pharmaceutical companies in the North knows that the moment we acknowledge that these are protectable and they have the duty to recognize the source and compensate the source, they know that they are going to have significant and monumental obligation to repay most of the genetic resources which have been pirated from Africa and many other countries, Latin America, for so many years. We should not hide in terms of questioning in terms of engaging in debates along these lines, so that we can also make sure that the local context, as opposed to the local content, becomes one of the priority in assessing the level of implementation of CFTA within the African setting. Now I move to the third point, having covered the historical, having covered the aspect of preparedness of Africa. Now the final bit of my discussion will be on the regulatory intricacies and the impediments arising from the current setup of laws on intellectual property, competition, and investment. Now, on this point, I would like to highlight some of the regulatory intricacies of intellectual property rights and competition that must be addressed for the smooth implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. I must acknowledge my appreciation to the AU, African Union, for swiftly adopting the 3 important protocols after phase 2 negotiation. And these are protocols on intellectual property, protocol on competition, and protocol on investment. That is a commendable measure from African perspectives. However, I have some doubts. What is doubtful to me is whether all the key players, meaning regulatory authorities and traders, fully appreciate the significance of these pertinent subjects, intellectual property rights, competition, within the continental trade context. Whether they appreciate, whether they are aware of. And my doubts are bolstered by at least 2 points. I'm trying to justify my doubt. Number one, when you read the text of the CFTA agreement as it is, when you read the text of the protocol on intellectual property, there is lack of clarity in terms of the needed interventions as far as the nexus between trade and intellectual property is concerned, between investment and intellectual property is concerned. Lack of clarity, action-oriented provisions within the protocol. Of course, there is a route, escape route, which is used by politicians. They say, no, there is a phase for annexes. Those issues will be handled in the annexes. And you really wait for the annexes to be so detailed, action-oriented, to appreciate that unless we properly address issues of intellectual property in the context of trade, then the very objectives of CFTA are also destined to fail or to face significant complications in the implementation. That's reason number one for my doubt. Number two is based on the lessons learned from intellectual property related trade disputes within our region, East Africa community. Allow me to highlight on the 2 high-profile court cases from East Africa, which raises some important issues regarding regional cross-border trade and investment. As a regulation for economic regional cooperation, we note that the treaty establishing East Africa community recognizes the importance of intellectual property protection for the furtherance of the objective of the treaty. It recognizes. If you read Article 103, Sub-Article 1 of the EAC Treaty, it encourages harmonization of the law and policies on intellectual property within partner states to East Africa. The same can be noted under the protocol on the establishment of the East African Community Common Market, which under Article 43 points to the need for cooperation amongst East African Community partner states in the field of intellectual property. Now, the 2 cases. I've picked these 2 cases because, number one, they've happened in the same region, East Africa community. The principles adduced from these 2 cases can inform any regional cooperation, any regional trade cooperation, including the African Continental Free Trade Area. So the first case originates from the jurisdiction of Rwanda. And it's between Mikoani Traders Limited versus Bakresa Grain Milling, Rwanda Limited. The two companies, which were all incorporated in Rwanda, were contesting for the ownership of a trademark Azania. Those from Tanzania, they know these two companies because they are registered in Rwanda, but they originate from Tanzania. They are all run by Tanzanians, but they expanded their investment and trade to Rwanda. Now, they were contesting for the ownership of a trademark Azania. Now, in Tanzania, as a matter of jurisdiction, Azania is owned by a company known as Mikoani Traders, who is the close competitor of Bakresa. Bakresa was the first to move to Rwanda, established their company, got the investment incentive certificate, constructed a grain milling factory. And as part of its initiative, it registered its various intellectual property, including trademark Azania. The registrar in Rwanda registered a trademark Azania in Rwanda. Some years down the line, Mikoani Trader also sought the opportunities presented by the market in Rwanda. They all moved to Rwanda, constructed a factory. They're all selling flowers. So having constructed the factory, having got all the necessary licenses, it started to manufacture and produced the product under the brand Azania. Only to be told that no, Azania is owned by a different person. You've got to find another trademark because here there is another owner. Upon inspection, who is the owner, he came to realize it's Bakresa. This is my close competitor in Tanzania. So the dispute came up, surfaced, they took the matter to the court. Because number one, the registrar in Rwanda refused to register Azania for Mikoani Traders. Said there is already another proprietor in the register. So the matter went up to the level of the High Court in Rwanda. And notice what the courts in Rwanda ruled. As a matter of law, intellectual property have got this principle of territoriality. That protection of your intellectual property is restricted to the territory, jurisdiction you have registered. No more. And the registrar in territory A is not bound by the registration in territory B unless the applicant relies on priority filing, which now requires you to file within specific timeline, which Mikoani Traders was hopelessly out of time. Could not rely on priority registration in Tanzania. So the court in Rwanda said they are not refusing to grant the prayer by Mikoani Traders. They say, no, registrar in Rwanda is not bound by the registration in Tanzania. So, trying to move the court through bad faith registration. Say this registration was motivated by bad faith because they know that I own the mark in Tanzania. They know we are competing in Tanzania. But the court refused to entertain also a bad faith claim. So as it stands, as we speak now, in Tanzania, Azania is owned by Mikoani Traders. In Rwanda, Azania is owned by Bakresa. What is the implication of this? Meaning that Azania cannot export their product using the brand Azania in Rwanda because trademark law gives exclusive rights in terms of importation, exportation, selling, stocking, and all those trade-related transactions. Case number one. Number two, Nairobi Java House. Those from Kenya know this, huh? And Uganda. This is from Uganda now. Nairobi Java House versus Mandela Auto Spares. Now, the ruling in this case, whose facts are more or less similar to Mikoani Traders and Azania, the ruling in this case presents quite an interesting interpretation of the trademark law against the ideals of common markets or free markets or cross-border trade. Now, the crux of the matter of disputes is between the Kenyan company, Nairobi Java House, battling against Ugandan company on the right to use the mark Java in Uganda. Each of the two parties had valid registration of the mark Java in their respective jurisdiction. Nairobi Java House, owner of the mark Java in Kenya, Mandela Auto Spares Limited, owner of the trademark Java in Uganda. Now, Nairobi Java attempted to expand this investment to Uganda. And we know Java, how famous it is in Kenya. They would barely accept to relinquish their rights over a mark Java. So they went to the registrar in Uganda. The registrar refused based on the territoriality. And deterred by the refusal by the registrar of trademark in Uganda, Nairobi Java House sought the audience and assistance of the court, High Court of Uganda, asking the court in Uganda to consider registration in Kenya should also inform the decision of the registrar in Uganda. Now, as you may remember, in Rwanda we have a different version in terms of the decision. Now, in Uganda, the court came up with a very interesting conclusion in deciding in favor of the Nairobi Nairobi Java House. He says, the court said, applying what may be termed as judicial overzealousness, the court asserted that the local trademark law should be interpreted in tandem with and in furtherance to the spirit of EAC Common Market Protocol, and not otherwise. That regulators should not ignore the spirit of the regional legal instruments, which have been devised in order to encourage free flow of goods and services. Now, of interest, the court said this: it is a matter of public interest for the East African community to consider what to do with marks registered prior in another member state and sought to be registered in yet a different member state to the community. Furthermore, the court stated, the decision of the registrar in Uganda stifles free movement of services within the East Africa community by restriction on the registration of the trademark registered prior in time in Kenya on the ground of registration of trademark albeit registered later in time to Uganda. So ultimately, the court came up with a different conclusion. The High Court of Uganda came up with a different conclusion when compared to the High Court in Rwanda, by accepting that at the end of the day, the spirit of the community should be paramount in deciding local and interpreting local trademark law. So the investment of Nairobi Java House was allowed in Uganda, and they were allowed to use their mark Java. So what are the key takeaways from the two court rulings debriefed above? Number one, matters of intellectual property are central and critical in the cross-border trade and investment. If they are not carefully regulated, they are going to stifle cross-border trade, they are going to stifle cross-border investment. Hence, effective implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area depends on, among others, that's my argument, a continental consensus on how existing and future intellectual property rights should be treated under African Continental Free Trade Area to alleviate escalation of trade disputes. We've got to find a way, and research and narrative from Africa need to be developed. How do you handle existing rights? How do you handle the future rights? And maybe we need to revisit the territoriality principle as it is applied in the traditional intellectual property, because otherwise these are the principles which are going to stifle implementation of this African Continental Free Trade Area. That's lesson number one. Number two, judicial positions in different jurisdictions on interpretation of fundamental tenets and principles governing intellectual property differs from country to country. as we have already demonstrated, the position in Uganda differing from the position of the court taken in Rwanda. Similar factual scenario, similar factual situation. Hence, unless as AU or CFTA sort this out, the progressive implementation of African Continental Free Trade Area may be thwarted. And in Africa, we are also facing another complication. We have two regional organizations on intellectual property. They've got ARIPO, they've got OAPI. They've got this Francophone, Anglophone. And the rules are different. The tenets which are applied under OAPI is different. The mode of registration, other countries, members of OAPI have relinquished their sovereignty as far as intellectual property is concerned to OAPI is different from ARIPO. So these are the issues which need to be looked into on how we bring this continent together such that we achieve the intended objective. Having said that, now finally, let me conclude by highlighting some of the pertinent questions and issues which may be considered for future research and the regulatory calibration. Number one, the quest for developing the African narrative regarding domestic prerequisites and best modality for the engagement and implementation of African Continental Free Trade Area. I think this has been mentioned in the preliminary speeches. We really need to figure it out. The problems I've highlighted are not new in the global regional markets. If you go to EU, they had to go through the same process and issues. Post-World War II, when the EU was born, then a lot of IP-related issues were controlled and owned by different proprietors across EU. And that's why now we have what you call the Harmonization Office on matters of intellectual property. They know that without addressing this, we are not going to have an effective regional market. NAFTA had also the same issues, North America Free Trade Area, and that's why they have 17th chapter of NAFTA. The whole chapter is devoted to intellectual property. Quite a detailed guide in terms of how issues of intellectual property in the context of trade, cross-border trade should be addressed. So that's an important aspect. We have to develop the narrative that best suits Africa. And at the bottom of it, we need to engage what we call public participation and active engagement from civil societies. In that way, we'll bring CFTA to the people as a principal organ or principal platform through which inclusive development of Africa can be achieved. Number two, improving the trade environment through comprehensive legal reforms. Most available studies suggest that CFTA can boost intra-Africa trade and incomes. However, to ensure that this occurs, there is a need for comprehensive and holistic reforms in terms of the local legal systems, policy setups that should be guided to achieve the intended objective. The reform agenda should include improving the trade environment, such as transport, telecommunication infrastructure, access to finance and credit, and also domestic security and enhancing the rule of law. As we pointed out, that these are the critical components for any successful trade or investment. Number three, reforms of domestic laws. Similarly, there is a need to reform domestic laws and dispute settlement system to ensure that they can address the cross-border legal problem. The two cases I've discussed illustrate that there is a need of having harmonization of approaches, because otherwise within CFTA, we may have a scenario where West African, they have their own position with regard to issues, East Africa, Central Africa. We need a consensus. And this should be reflected in the instrument and also domestic laws. Number four, issues of equality, inclusive and sustainable development. While we explore ways through which the African Continental Free Trade Area can be brought to the people, we should also interrogate through our academic discourse and research whether free trade under the African Continental Free Trade Area will generate benefits for all through trickle-down growth. Understandably, we understand in a global trading system, there is no a scenario where you have also all-win structure. All-win structure. There must be some countries which will benefit more than the other. So the question is, how do you leverage that such that the disparity is not significant, such that it brings also the sentiment and also the feeling that maybe we need to get out of this. Because at the end of the day, we are just part of the procession. And the leaders and people who are benefits are maybe few countries. So there will be differential in terms of benefit, but we need to leverage in terms of how do we capture local scenarios such that all countries take benefits. In conclusion, let me reiterate the expression of my appreciation to the organizers for this conference for inviting me to deliver this keynote address. And I look forward to the coming days of engaging and constructive academic exchange, discussions, and debates. We should not be afraid, as we have been assured, that we should engage, we should express, should bring new ideas. Some may be controversial, some may be unpopular, but in the field of, in the realm of academicians, we are not afraid to bring some unpopular ideas. And I'm aware some of the ideas which were at one point considered to be unpopular, later we came to realize this is the way to go. So I also encourage this bringing issues and also ideas which are of continental relevance, point out the important lessons, expose the opportunities, and articulate the needed interventions. Only if we do that with our honest, free, and also courageous spirit, we'll be able to help our dear continent, and particularly the CFTA, to achieve its intended objectives. I wish you the very best in the constructive deliberation, and I would like to sign off by saying, Karibuni sana, Dar es Salaam.